A new study claims that eating in an 8-hour window each day could more than double your risk of dying from heart disease. That's a headline designed to stop you in your tracks, especially if you've been experimenting with intermittent fasting. But what does this study really show, and should it change the way you eat? Hello, I'm Monica Reinagel, and you are listening to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we take a closer look at nutrition news, research, and trends so that you can make more informed decisions about what and when you eat. A recent study on intermittent fasting has been getting a lot of attention. The fasting technique known as TRE, time restricted eating, which basically means restricting all your food intake to a relatively short window of time each day, remains very popular with both researchers and the general public as a tool for weight loss and weight maintenance, but also as a strategy for managing blood sugar, slowing the aging process, and much more. And this new analysis has thrown some cold water on all of that enthusiasm. It found that people who observed an 8-hour eating window each day had a significantly higher risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. I've already heard from several listeners asking for my thoughts on this new study, so let's take a closer look at what this study actually found and what it might mean for you if you are someone who has adopted or is thinking about trying this approach. So the researchers looked at about 20,000 American adults and divided them into groups according to how long their reported eating window was. That is, the time between their first and their last meals of the day. And they found that those who reported a very short eating window, less than 8 hours between their first and their last bites, were more than twice as likely to die of cardiovascular disease as those with a longer eating window, 12 hours or more. So that's the headline. And as headlines go, it's a good one in that it's pretty sensational. If you are someone who practices or recommends this particular style of intermittent fasting, I bet it got your attention. But I think there are some important caveats that we need to consider before we overreact here. First of all, this is obviously a correlation. It does not prove that the length of the eating window had anything to do with these people's cause of death. And in fact, there's another detail from the study that bears mentioning here. Although this analysis found that the people with the shortest eating window had a higher risk of death from heart disease, those same people did not have a higher risk of dying overall. So that would seem to imply that even if they had an increased risk of CVD, they must have had a lower risk of dying of any other causes, such as cancer. But more likely, this paradox is explained by the various kinds of uncertainty that can be introduced in these types of statistical analyses. For example, if there were relatively few deaths from cardiovascular disease in this group, then a very small increase could have an outsized effect on those risk calculations. So for you statistic nerds out there, the CI, or confidence interval, for this particular finding was 1.39 to 3.98, which suggests there's a lot of wiggle room here. But look, I don't think you need to be a statistics nerd to appreciate some of the other limitations in this analysis. This study was done using data from a large ongoing U.S. survey called NHANES. And part of this survey involves participants doing something called a 24-hour dietary recall. So working with a trained interviewer, the participants report everything they ate or drank over a 24-hour period. And this information gets tabulated and coded and entered into the database. And this allows researchers to look at associations between the intake of various nutrients and food groups, or in this case, the length of various eating windows with different health outcomes. Participants typically do a couple of those 24-hour recalls over the course of a study in an effort to capture what their typical eating patterns are. But I want you to just pause for a moment and think about your own eating patterns. How much do they change from day to day or season to season? How likely is it that a recall that you did on a random day 5 years ago reflects how you typically eat today? Over the past 10 years or so, have you ever adjusted the composition of your meals in response to new research or information? I know I have. Or perhaps you've made modifications because of changes in your health or your lifestyle. Have you ever tried out a new eating pattern or a dietary approach for a few days or weeks and then just decided it wasn't for you? I sure have. So, if I were to throw a dart at the calendar and do a 24-hour dietary recall with you, what are the chances that that day would be representative of your typical eating patterns over the course of that entire year, much less that entire decade? So, my point is this: even if we assume that people accurately remember and report everything they eat, which right there is a big assumption, I still have my doubts that these 24-hour recalls give us a reliable picture of people's eating windows over a long span of time, or that these outcomes necessarily apply to people who are intentionally following a time-restricted eating protocol. When I saw the headlines regarding this newly published paper, I actually had a moment of deja vu because I remembered similar headlines popping up about a year and a half ago. And that's because this isn't the first time that we've seen results from this research group. Back in March of 2024, they presented preliminary findings at a meeting of the American Heart Association. And at that time, the data suggested that people who reported a shorter eating window had a 91% higher risk of dying from cardiovascular disease compared to those who spread their intake out over a wider time frame. That's not quite as dramatic as the 135% increase in risk that ended up in the final paper, but it was still enough to garner some media attention. But at the same time, it also drew some constructive criticism from experts. For example, Dr. Kevin McConway, he's an emeritus professor of applied statistics at Open University, had this to say back then. To relate their eating times over those two 24-hour periods to a deliberate, long-term, time-restricted eating intervention seems to be going far beyond the data. End quote. Tom Sanders, a professor emeritus of nutrition and dietetics at King's College London, pointed out that the people who were reporting short eating windows may have been doing so because they work jobs that hinder their ability to have more regular meal times. Things like truck drivers or security personnel or health professionals or night shift workers. And these are all types of work that are known to be associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And others pointed out that people who were already sick may have been more likely to eat in shorter windows. That's something researchers call reverse causation. And that could explain the association that they saw here. And you know what? This is exactly how this is supposed to work. Preliminary findings get shared at conferences where other sciences can poke holes and raise questions and suggest refinements. And the authors then go back, they take that feedback into account, and ideally are able to produce a stronger, more carefully analyzed paper. And that appears to be exactly what happened here. The subsequent publication actually sharpened the conclusion. Instead of a 91% higher risk, the more refined analysis reported a 135% higher risk of cardiovascular mortality for those with the shorter eating windows. And they accomplished this by dividing those subjects into narrower eating window buckets. But what it didn't do is erase the baked-in limitations of the study design. At the end of the day, although the size and the scope of the NHANES dataset make it an attractive target for researchers, it's probably not the best tool for answering this particular study question. So what does all of this mean for you? Well, first of all, there's no reason to panic if you've been experimenting with intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating. This study does not prove that eating within a short window causes cardiovascular disease. If you find that limiting your eating to a shorter window helps you manage your appetite or your weight or your blood sugar, there may be real benefits to this approach. But those benefits don't require you to compress everything into a strict 8-hour span. So a more moderate eating window, say 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day, could provide many of the same advantages while avoiding the concerns that were flagged in this research. And remember, meal timing is only one piece of this puzzle. The quality of the food you eat, how active you are, how well you sleep, how you're managing stress are probably going to have a much larger impact on your risk of heart disease and your overall health than whether you finish your dinner at 3 p.m. or 6 p.m. And finally, if you have an existing condition like cardiovascular disease or diabetes or cancer, it's always smart to talk with your doctor or a nutrition professional before you adopt an extreme eating window or any other really big change in your diet, because they can help you weigh the potential risks and benefits in the context of your overall health and situation. Meanwhile, if you have another question that you'd like me to tackle on the podcast, you can email it to me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. And if you are an educator or a health professional, these are the types of topics that I regularly present on in educational settings and at professional meetings throughout the country. For more information, please check out wellnessworkshere.com. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Holly Hutchings is our director of podcasts. Steve Riekeberg is our audio engineer. Morgan Christensen heads up podcast operations and advertising. Rebecca Sebastian is our manager of marketing and publicity. And Nat Hoops is our marketing and operations assistant. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to you for listening.